The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akilia Nai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share this stream, invite your friends and family to it, so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion. This week, the chairman reads Chapter 2 from the book Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. Chapter 2 is titled, Our Party Solved the Problems of the Revolution. You can find the study materials in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions. Learn how the African People's Socialist Party, over its near 50-year history, answered the most fundamental questions to move our revolutionary movement from a point of defeat to a point of inevitable victory. We ask that throughout the study, you can prepare your questions regarding the topic so the chairman can expound more on certain ideas. It is my honor to introduce the leader and founder of this party, the leader of the worldwide African Revolution, the person who carried the defeat of the Black Revolution on his shoulders and trudged forward to build the Vanguard Party that is leading the way in this struggle to overthrow this bloody social system. My leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru.
Uhuru Comrades. First thing I really would like to do is to send a shout out and welcome to all the comrades who participated with me on yesterday in the interim leadership meeting of the African Socialist International. There were people who from the United States who function as a part of that leadership, but also there were people there who were from Rotterdam in Holland, the Netherlands as it's called, from London, from Paris, from Accra, Ghana in West Africa, and from Gauteng in South Africa. And I'm sending a special shout out because I think it's really important, as we talked in our meeting on yesterday, to recognize the significance of spreading African internationalism. It is our responsibility to make the philosophy, the ideology of the party, the ideology of the broad masses of our people throughout the world, not only in the United States and the places that I just mentioned, but throughout the world, everywhere Africans are. And I know there are people who are either participating in our movement or anticipating this kind of participation in more places than what I've just mentioned. I know that we're in South America and even in the Middle East. There's someone who is participating probably in this study on today. So I wanted to really welcome you. And I also wanted to send a shout out because we are having a discussion today from the political report to our 7th Congress. And we're looking at the second chapter in this political report that's been put in book form, and it's titled Our Party Solved the Problems of the Revolution. And it's really important for everybody in all the forces and organizations of the party to recognize that this is our history. It is not just the history of people who might have been in the party some time ago, or might be in the party in the United States, or might be in the party in England. It is the history of the entire party, even if you've just come into the party yesterday. And those of you who are participating in this study, who may come into the party tomorrow, this is your history as well. And it's important for us to understand that. In part, it is important because the United States government and the imperialist forces around the world succeeded in crushing a revolutionary movement that was centered in the struggle for African liberation. Truly it was. Just as today we see all of the imperialist forces and all the wannabe imperialists and all of the even newcomers to the camp of imperialism fighting to occupy Africa and to extract more and more resources. It is because of the centrality of Africa, the question of Africa, to the revolutionary project at large, to the defeat of capitalism, to the success of capitalism, and to the advent of a genuine international revolutionary movement that will destroy this false dichotomy of national liberation. That is, it resolves the whole conundrum that the so-called socialist movement has been confronted with around socialism in one country. And this is something that has troubled and made problematic all of the socialist movements and Marxist movements throughout the world, this whole notion of socialism in one country, because clearly socialism, capitalism is a global system. It's a worldwide system. It's a world economy. It came to be a world economy in part because of the centrality of Africa and the slave trade in developing the whole world economy, the capitalist world economy. And it's going to be destroyed as a consequence of the actions of people in this party who are dispersed, forcibly dispersed part of the nation throughout the world. And we are the central force that will bring this social system down. And so this whole notion of socialism in one country that has been such a conundrum for the socialist movement is resolved by the advent of the African Socialist International and African internationalism. So I wanted to just make that observation. And also, as I mentioned, the African Revolution of the 1960s was crushed. So some people, that's been a disturbing notion. Some people who are very close to me, in fact, I had a discussion within the last week of a comrade who's very close to our party, close to me, and there's a severe reluctance to say that the Black Revolution of the 1960s was defeated, because there's a romantic notion of the invincibility of a revolutionary movement. And to say that the revolution was defeated is not to dispute something that was said by Thomas Sankara on one hand, and Fred Hampton even earlier, that you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. And the revolution as a concept can't be killed. But the fact is that revolution is more than just a concept. For it to be significant, revolution is something that is made by people and led by people and revolutionary organization. If you destroy the revolutionary organization and the people who are responsible for making that revolution, you defeat the revolution. Doesn't mean it's forever defeated. As long as the oppression and exploitation continues to exist, then revolution is necessary, and someone is going to pick up the gauntlet. But the fact is, if you don't say it was defeated, if you don't recognize that, then you can languish doing nothing forever, saying, well, the revolution is never defeated, the revolution can't be defeated, and then it doesn't mean that you are responsible for doing anything like repairing, rebuilding, completing a revolution that was defeated. I don't know if I'm absolutely clear, but the point is that we have a plenary coming up in February, and everybody who's participating in this study, no matter where you are in this country, although in this world, in fact, although it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, I know for people on the continent of Africa to get into this country, it's always hard for that to happen, but you should be here. And the title, theme, or slogan for this plenary is Vanguard Up, the unity of theory and practice. The unity of theory and practice. So the revolution as a theory is always there. But the fact is that to make revolution is a practical responsibility that we have to take on. And so we're doing this study now, not in part because one of the consequences of the defeat of the revolution is that we continue to experience it even up to now. I mean, that's been more than 2 generations since the revolution was defeated. And it's been long enough for some people, many people who now participate in the movement and activism and what have you, to have no memory of a revolutionary period. And so almost anything can pass as revolution, but that hasn't always been the case. The fact is we struggle throughout the whole civil rights period, civil rights movement and what have you, and even the militant component of the civil rights movement, activists, this sector of the movement that was characterized by direct action and what have you, which also at a particular time in our history distinguished from NAACP type legalism. Then there was direct action where we would actually, people would actually engage in consciously breaking the law and what have you to try to create contradictions within the system to force the system to do something that you want to do. But the fact is we went through that. And we achieved and this was the assault on the African Revolution happened at a time when many of these issues were being debated. The Black Panther Party did not just simply emerge people with guns. There was a debate within the African liberation movement in the United States, as an example, about the validity of armed struggle. Whether armed struggle was something that was legitimate as compared to the stance that was taken by the liberal sector of the African petty bourgeoisie of this nonviolent, pacifist, and as Malcolm characterized it, masochist approach to struggle. And so this was a debate that was raging within the National Liberation Movement, and Malcolm X himself, who has stepped forward and saying that there's the difference in the Black Revolution and the Negro Revolution. He's the one who says that you got to know what a revolution is, what the motivation of a revolution, motive of a revolution, what the objectives of a revolution and the tactics of a revolution. This is something that has to be understood. This is a practical question that had to be addressed, and we were moving beyond just that civil rights thing. And this was the time that our struggle had actually defeated U.S. imperialism inside this country, had been defeated politically and ideologically. Now, this was happening as a part of a struggle of oppressed people around the world. Everybody, Vietnam, throughout South America and other places in the world, people were trying to get the boot of imperialist white power off our necks. And this was the debate and struggle that people were engaged in, the validity of armed struggle, and armed struggle that actually was blazing in places like Vietnam. And of course, we had experienced the Chinese Revolution, we would have experienced the Cuban Revolution, and all of these were influential aspects of our thoughts. Algeria, the revolution in Algeria, and Frantz Fanon entry into this whole discussion about what revolution was. We'd gone past that milquetoast civil rights, we shall overcome era. And we were debating, in serious debate about what revolution was going to look like, and the United States government and imperialist forces around the world did everything they could to crush this revolution, and in fact they defeated. They killed Che, they overthrew Lumumba, they killed, overthrew and murdered Lumumba, they overthrew Nkrumah and eventually murdered him. They killed Malcolm, they killed King, they killed members of the Black Panther Party killed the co-founder of the African People's Socialist Party, and then they left in place another component of the counterinsurgency, that is to say the war against the revolutionary movement. They left in place these liberals, and some of whom they have created themselves and pumped up, and now after having fought so seriously ideologically against the notion excuse me, I've been fighting for the last month, some bug, and I hope that's all it is. Ideologically, the government, U.S. government fighting ideologically against us for such a long period of time, they initiated a military assault on the revolution all around the world. And as we've said before, the military assault was not simply to kill persons. It was to kill ideas. It was to undermine ideas and to raise up another set of ideas. Of course, the vehicle for those ideas were individuals that would replace revolutionary ideas. So this contest we've been involved in is really important. And the theory is important. And when the party was born, as I said, it was at a point where the revolution had really sort of was approaching a crescendo in terms of involvement of people. There was a study done, and no, I can't remember the dates or anything like that. I'm not an intellectual like that. But by one of the popular news magazines in this country, it was called U.S. World and News Report, something like that. It was reputed, and I believe it was true, to have been an instrument of the CIA, but then which isn't, an instrument of the CIA or the federal government. But they did, in the 1960s, they did a survey in the United States, and 10% of the people, Africans who they talked to, considered themselves revolutionaries. They said, I am a revolutionary. That's 10%. And this is a response they were given to white people because the U.S. World and News Report didn't have African reporters and people doing that. So you think about in the 1960s, 10% of the population declared themselves to be revolutionary. That was a profound statement of revolutionary fervor and consciousness that had permeated the entire existence of African people in this country. And because it had permeated the existence of Africans, it had permeated everything. Everything. So it wasn't just a question of white people suddenly getting afros. That happened. But it was also white people and others being influenced by the revolutionary movement. So what was at one time the black liberation movement became the gay liberation movement, the women's liberation movement, and all these other liberation movements because of the power and strength. And because the whole ideological foundation of U.S. imperialism and imperialism at large in the world is what people refer to as racism. As I say, the foundation rests upon an explanation of the reality that Africans have to relationship to this social system. When African revolution rose up, it shook the entire ideological foundation of the social system itself. And so this is why women's liberation, gay liberation, all these other things began to emerge because they were liberated ideologically and philosophically by the African liberation movement, even though in many instances, some of these forces that I'm talking about turned themselves, they were anti-African in their expression because they stayed tethered to and wedded to imperialist white power. So they were able to say that we want this for white women. They didn't say white women, they say women. Just like the Marxists and communists don't say white workers, they say workers, but that's effectively what they are talking about. And so this is what happened. And so anyway, I wanted to say that we're coming to this study from Vanguard, which is the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. It's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing mission within the party to unite members of the party, people in our movement, people who support us, and even people who don't support us at this point, with where the party is trying to go, the conclusions that were voted on, expressed, and united with at our 7th Congress, that's reflected in this political report. And we took a little more than a month, away from the study to deal with the issue of revolutionary philosophy, the science of investigating and analyzing society, phenomena in the world. We took Maurice Cornforth's work on materialism and the dialectical method, and we took a lot of time working with that. And we did that because we think it's really important to take into the working class movement an understanding of philosophy, one. Because generally speaking, the working class, and perhaps it is true of most people, don't recognize philosophy. I mean, we have been inundated with philosophy of our oppressors, but we don't necessarily recognize philosophy, just the way people think about stuff and do stuff. But there's no assumption on our part, generally speaking, that this is a this is a worldview that has been imposed on us. We don't even understand how, as a consequence of having this worldview, we hear other worldviews. We might hear another worldview, and we find it startlingly upsetting and wrong, because how we understand the world is how we've been taught to understand the world by the social system that dominates our existence, our life. Even the enslaved will find ourselves trapped with the worldview of those who have enslaved us. And some Africans in this who are listening, participating, know exactly what I'm talking about. Because the whole notion of African ineptitude, that it's not something that has simply been created, and it's mere fanciful creation. You can go back forever in history and just see the genius of Africa and African people and what has been created, but that's been taken from us. And the African working class and the African nation as a whole has lost any sense of any self-confidence, and partially as a consequence of first the attack and defeat, and then the imposition of alien and foreign worldview that serves the imperial powers, and we learn how to think about the world based on that. We don't even learn how to think about the world based on our own interests. Comrade Glenn Ford, we work with him in the Black Hispanic Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations, and he was talking about a Pew study that was done, a couple of years ago. This was after the election of Barack Hussein Obama, and where the actual conditions of African people in this country had deteriorated precipitously. But with this survey that was done, supposedly scientific survey, and I believe that, showed that while white people and people who are characterized as Latinos, although most of them ain't Latin, had said that things were bad in this country, African people for whom things were worse than anybody said things were splendid, were great. And you have this whole what do you call it, a dichotomy? Is that what it is characterized as? Here, the Africans who are treated worse are convinced that we're better off because Barack Hussein Obama has been selected as the new face for imperialist white power. And we make this assumption that because it's him, that we have power as well. So Obama is there, so it somehow translates to black people having power. But we want to work with this because we wanted to go through the dialectical materialism because we think that understanding philosophy is going to even make it easier to understand what we're dealing with in the political report, because the political report uses a method of investigation and analysis that's referred to as dialectical historical materialism. And it is rooted in a particular worldview. So we want to make it easier for people to deal with this. And this is not an assumption of any superior knowledge, well, perhaps more knowledge, which is something quantifiable, but, not somebody smarter than somebody else. It's not because we read tea leaves or have visions based on the quality of and quantity of what we're smoking, or anything like that. There's a way that we can investigate and understand the world, but the majority of African people who are locked, our worldview is often limited to the scope of our actual mobility. That is to say, most of us live in our villages and don't get outside the villages and communities that we live in. And many of us are not literate in the colonial languages and what have you. Even people in our party and what have you who struggle with that, and which is a statement about the extent of the oppression in many ways, but it's colonialism. And so that's not a real problem. But what it is that we have this continual discussion. And sometimes some people who are participating in this study will find it redundant and boring what I'm talking about, because if that's the case, I'm not talking that way for you. Except that you have a responsibility to help those of us who do not have access to the kind of information and the kind of literacy that to which you do. And I'm suggesting that we even have to set up readings of this politic, and those of us who know need to organize that. And it shouldn't be any kind of shame or anything associated with somebody not able to read a colonial language. The thing is that people need to understand, and what we will learn is that those people who are closest to the contradiction understand the contradiction better than those of us who read well about the contradiction, and can, once they have access to this method of investigation and analysis, they are the most profound leaders we have. And we know that to be the case in the African People's Socialist Party. So we want to share that. And that's one of the reasons I was glad to see the New York branch of International People's Democratic Uhuru movement has initiated an Uhuru, how's it characterized? Uhuru, I forgot the title of it, but they do, I think it's even a TV thing on how to try to bring masses to African internationalism. The problem I have with it, I'm glad to see that initiative, because that's part of what it is we have to do. That's what I'm calling on people who are participating in the African Socialist International to do, to spread African internationalism. I think it's called Uhuru Mindset. And the only problem I have with it is not connected to the agitprop, and they need to immediately connect that to the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, the African People's Socialist Party, to make sure that the Uhuru mindset that's supposed to bring people to African internationalist understanding meets the standards of the party, but that's what we have a responsibility to do. So I've said all of that. I usually wreck the entire study with this long-winded kind of overview, but I wanted to make these points. And I also want finally to say that most of the people, because we are talking about more than 2 generations of people not being associated with or connected to revolution, or even a revolutionary period of a sort. And many people are certainly in the party and in our movement have been introduced to revolutionary ideas through the party and our movement, don't necessarily recognize that the ideas that's coming from the party and our movement were ideas that were developed by the party and our movement. That during this whole period of defeat, the African People's Socialist Party continued to exist, continued to struggle, If you go back and look at the 70s, which is what many of the thinking representatives of the radical African petty bourgeoisie characterize as a dead moment in the history of struggle in this country, you'll see that it wasn't dead for us. It wasn't dead for the struggle of Free Pitts and Lee, for the struggle around Desi Woods, for the struggle. In fact, the African People's Socialist Party itself was born in 1972. It wasn't dead for the birth of the African People's Solidarity Movement and the opening up a whole new political and ideological front in this struggle that we're talking about. It wasn't dead in terms of the developing theory beyond what was dead, ossified assumptions associated with Marxism. And this is not an assault on Marx, by the way. In fact, most of the struggles we have with Marxists has nothing to do with Marx. It has to do with them. In fact, I don't know how true it was, but I've heard that Marx once said that all I know is I'm not a Marxist, right? And I think it was probably because he was having to contend with some of the same forces that we contend with now. That's one of the reasons. There are other contradictions with Marx, you know, but that's another story. But the thing is that the revolution had been defeated. We're talking about a period where this struggle for African liberation, for total liberation, that you found really being given political and ideological expression with Marcus Garvey, primarily. This struggle had been crushed. And you know, you think about the Garvey movement, which blew up around the early 19-teens, and really exploded by 1920. Which gave us the red, black, and green flag of 50,000 people showing up at Madison Square Garden to vote on that flag, to vote on Garvey. Africans from all around the world and places that people wouldn't necessarily consider to be African were involved in this extraordinary movement. And then, of course, the U.S. government, along with liberal Africans who, like W.E.B. Du Bois. I want to point Du Bois out because there are adherents of Du Bois even today who are nothing but liberal, petty bourgeois Africans who more than anything else simply have a radical perspective on assimilation. That's more or less what it is about. And so you have these kind of forces who surfaced. And Garvey movement did. So-called black socialists of that era all attacked Garvey and the Garvey movement, and and made the people declared that the African masses who followed Garvey were just crazy. That this charlatan who had somehow bamboozled the people and etc. had this incredible movement that he bamboozled them. He bamboozled the people into getting a steamship line. What kind of bamboozlement do we do that? What other bamboozler? There are people who have been building universities for mysterious universities now for scores of years. But Garvey bamboozled people to get a steamship line, to opening up factories and things like that, to trying to establish a base on the continent of Africa that could be used as a stepping stone to achieving liberation of all Africa. He intervened in the League of Nations efforts to carve up Africa again at this time and say who was going to get what parts of Africa that had not been claimed with the Berlin Conference. He intervened with the slogan, "Demand Africa for Africans, those at home and those abroad." Not for Garvey, for Africans. Africa for Africans at home and abroad. This is the bamboozler, so when you see that kind of movement, that's an offensive struggle. That's an offensive anti-imperialist struggle that happened at the same time. We had people in other parts of the world who were struggling and part of a national liberation movement that included people like Pancho Villa, and others who were struggling against this whole imperialist force. Defeat of Garvey movement, along with allies of imperialism, sometimes clothed in radical rhetoric, and who worked consciously with the United States government, Garvey must go. Not imperialism must go. Not the U.S. must go. Not the French of control of Africa must go. Garvey must go became the rallying cry for all of these forces. And so they united and they helped to crush the Garvey movement and jail Garvey. And then they participated in the first integration of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The U.S. Domestic Secret Police, it integrated because they needed an African to go into the Garvey movement to help destroy it. This is what integration was about. They bring Africans into the FBI so that they could help destroy the Garvey movement because a white person couldn't have done that. So you had that, and then when they destroyed that, then what we have emergence is this thing called a civil rights movement. So you had an aggressive, offensive struggle against imperialism that was reflected in the Garvey movement. The defeat of Garvey, along with the assistance of people like Du Bois and others, you see the emergence of this thing that would come to be known as civil rights movement, et cetera, which was a retreat. It was a defensive movement. As opposed to offensive that we were on, it's a defensive movement, not to overturn our relationship with the imperial capitalist system, but to find a way to make this system accommodating to us, and essentially accommodating to a sector of the talented 10th, if you listen to what Du Bois said, who would represent the rest of us within the circles of the bourgeoisie. Anyway, I've overtalked it. So now, when the party was founded, a movement, people had been killed, wiped out. People were, there were still remnants of the movement around, but effectively, the revolutionary movement had been crushed. The revolutionary movement that had been born through the process of the civil rights movement getting out of hand, the workers becoming more influential, from people like Fannie Lou Hamer to Malcolm X, who was the first generation worker class, that northern-based worker who was involved in this struggle. And then this sector that was most associated with national liberation, like Garvey, you saw the original Nation of Islam being a part of that. And then you saw others who also wrapped in mysticism. And this often happens when revolutions are destroyed, revolutionary movements are defeated, then you see people often gravitate toward mysticism, some form of religions and things like that. And so much of our movement that was for national liberation, as opposed to trying to find a way to integrate, and people would demonstrate and go to jail to integrate, right? Much of our movement that would believe in what we call national liberation, usually they would refer to a separatist movement and things like that, separate from the white man, and it was devoid of science, and so in some instances it was mystical expressions of anti-colonial movement. The white man is the devil. Separate from the devil. Separate from the devil. Do for self. This is what we were hearing in some instances. And then people learned, the different handshakes and clothing that you could wear and ceremonies that we could have and things like this, on the one hand. On the other hand, anything that approximated a kind of scientific based struggle, where empirical evidence and data represented the actual conditions of existence of African people, that was something that was dominated by a sector of the African petty bourgeoisie that was mostly involved in and interested in some form of assimilation, even if they were radical assimilation, even if it was assimilation that said that somehow we're going to become an auxiliary to the white working class, taking power, and then if they agree, then we can have our own separate 5 states or our own separate black belt south or something to that effect. That was the only place you could find that. So the party emerges, in the midst of all of this stuff, and recognizing the absolute need to bring science back into this. Theory is critically important. It's the worldview. It makes a prediction of the future. That's what theory does. If you don't have a prediction of the future that you're fighting for, then almost anything will do, because you're not guided by this long-term objective, right? Anyway, I'm saying all of that just to say something about, so people will understand the morass of stuff that the party had to go through, fighting, first of all, the recognition of the significance of theory. Secondly, in summing up and developing a worldview that represented the reality of Africa and African people, and in so doing, the reality of the world, because there is no black reality that's separate and independent from the reality of the whole world. The thing is, that's what we say, a worldview, to discover our place and destiny, not in some abstract, but in the world. And to do that, you got to know something about the world too. You just can't know something about yourself, right? Anyway, so I've expended a lot of time. So I'm on chapter 2, and this is page 43. The African People's Socialist Party was born in the heat of struggle at a time when the U.S. government was bent on destroying the black revolution of the 60s. Together with the heroic revolution of the people of Vietnam against U.S. colonial occupation, the black revolution constituted an existential threat to imperialist white power. In other words, the existence of imperialist white power was threatened. The continuing existence of imperialist white power was threatened by the African revolution in this country, by struggle in Vietnam and other struggles happening around the world. The freedom movement of African people within current U.S. borders had broken from the absolute leadership of the liberal sector of the African petty bourgeoisie and was fighting to become one with the anti-colonial movement sweeping the planet. All the peoples of all countries wanted freedom from the capitalist parasite that had come into existence through colonial slavery and dominated the world. This is not what the Marxists were saying. Even when the Marxists were saying support the struggle of the Vietnamese people, they were not able to recognize the fact that that the peoples of all countries, they can say, yeah, everybody wants freedom, but we said from the capitalist parasite that had come into existence, through colonial slavery and dominated the world. And that was important, to recognize that this parasite had come into existence through slavery and colonialism and dominated the world. If you know how it came into existence, if you know what brought it into existence, then you're also informed about what it takes to destroy it and really what the crisis is. The crisis is not some what do they call it? Like they call it overproduction of capital on top of a pedestal of the oppression and exploitation of everybody else. We're saying that capitalist system as a whole, all of it, rests upon the theft of resources and the oppression of the colonized peoples of the world. That's where it comes from. So no matter how it manifests itself in the world, no matter whether or not it is calm and stable and there is no overproduction within the capitalist system, no matter who is a Democrat or Republican, no matter if, in fact, the capitalist system is one where the dictatorship of capital is visible, like it is with African and colonized people, or invisible, as it is usually and traditionally with Europeans, or if it becomes visible for Europeans, the dictatorship of capital, it becomes visible, which is called fascism. That's what white people talk. This is what they talk about when they say fascism. That the dictatorship that's visible to everybody else in the world, all the Africans all the time recognize that we live under a brutal dictatorship, even if sometimes there's a dichotomy between, I was in a store just the other day and I was wearing this same hat. and an African worker in the store saw me, and it was during the time where white people celebrate what they call Veterans Day. And the African in the store who was stocking the shelf, he saluted me and he said, "Is that a Russian?" I said, "Yeah. It's not only the Russian, it's Soviet." He said, "Oh man, I saluted a Russian," etc. So he feels disloyal for having saluted a damn Russian, like the Russians enslaved your ass, right? And like the Russians are the ones that's responsible for killing African people on the streets and out in this country every day. Like the Russians are the one that colonized African people all around the world. This is the dichotomy that we're looking at, which helps to make this us understand, hopefully, this even better. So we say that. So the fact is that the social system rests upon a foundation of African colonization, slavery, on a foundation of the oppression and colonial domination of the vast majority of the peoples on the earth. This is where this is what has to be destroyed. As opposed to, you have the colonized, the colonial leftists tell us that what has to happen is that we, the vast majority of people upon whom the whole social system relies for its existence, instead of fighting to overturn this relationship we have to unite with the white working class. Otherwise, we are breaking up the unity of the international working class, or something to that effect. So they have centered themselves. Because, you know why they're able to center themselves that way? Because the whole social system that includes white leftists, white rightists, Trumpists, Sanderites, and Warrenists, and the rest of them rest upon this foundation of colonialism and slavery of the rest of the world. So all of them, the same social system that gave rise to Donald Trump gave rise to Jeremy Corbyn. Same social system gave rise to all of them. So the Chinese, Korean, and Cuban revolutions had ignited the imagination of oppressed peoples everywhere. Capitalism had been born as a global white power and defined itself as such. The world capitalists had previously predicted their own invincibility as custodians of the planet. Many of the oppressed had also been convinced of this until the revolutions of oppressed peoples achieved universality and shook the imperialist world as its foundation. We say the revolutions of oppressed people achieved universality. It means it became the universal expression. It became the dominant expression of the peoples around the world. Everybody's fighting to be free. Everybody's fighting to make this revolution. It's not some isolated pocket. And when this happens, of course, as this happens, then the mindset of oppressed peoples everywhere is open. What do they call it? The Uhuru mindset in New York, with the leadership of the Director of Agitation and Propaganda. That's what it's going to be called, and that's what it's going to be. Africans within the U.S. were affected by the escalating scope of anti-colonial revolution. Many were forced to reevaluate the definition of our struggle in the U.S. as simply one for civil rights within the existing social system. We began to recognize the struggle for civil rights as being rooted in philosophical idealism and patriotism to the very system and people responsible for our oppression. So you're fighting for civil rights in a system of slavery. Think about that. You live in a slave system, and what you're fighting for is civil rights in a system of slavery. So it means to be accepted as a part of the system of slavery. It's a system that's not just based on your enslavement, but enslavement of the people of the world. Is that what we are fighting for? My own personal political history began to solidify during this period of anti-colonial upheaval. I was fortunate to have been born during an era when anti-colonial struggle was the main trend in the world. These revolutions resulted in political independence for India, followed quickly by the success of the Chinese Revolution of 1949, an era that was reshaping the economic, political, and ideological contours of the world. I was thereby able to envision a future shorn of white colonial domination. When I say I was able to envision a future shorn of white colonial domination, it doesn't mean that I say, wow, we can have a future shorn of white colonial domination. What I mean is my consciousness was affected by this. Whether I intended, I didn't go to political education classes. I was born in this world during this time where everybody was fighting against white power. Even Africans were happy to see the Japanese fascists, as they were characterized, successful in the struggle against the United States. The Pearl Harbor was everybody cheering, yeah, because somebody hit the white man, messed up the white man, that kind of thing. So it was a way that people all around the world, oppressed and colonized people, were able to envision. I was able. I didn't plan it that way, and I didn't even necessarily know it happened when it did happen. But my worldview was affected by what was happening in the world, by oppressed peoples everywhere fighting. My personal political development initially moved me to join the U.S. military in an ill-informed, youthful attempt to extricate myself and my future from the prevailing blatant white domination in the U.S. city of my birth, in the southern U.S. city of my birth. I found that the U.S. Army was a reflection and guardian of the injustices I attempted to evade through my enlistment. As a consequence of my struggles in the military, I was grudgingly granted a discharge. And there's a long story with that, and one day we'll have an opportunity to talk about that, because they actually escorted me off a military base on the armed guard because of the activity that I had initiated while I was in the Army, you know. As a consequence of, so I was grudgingly granted a discharge. Shortly thereafter, I found my footing in the organized resistance by joining the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, a youthful and dynamic front of the civil rights movement that was responsible for raising the slogan demand for Black Power in 1966. The Black Power demand put SNCC on a collision course with the U.S. government and the liberal sector and the liberal leaders of the civil rights movement, leaders who owed their success to their relationship with sectors of the white ruling class. In fact, while Martin Luther King never came out and said, no, down with Black Power, he did in many ways. And you had like SCLC led by Martin Luther King and people like Jesse Jackson and the rest of them, they came up with soul power as a contest with Black Power. The Black Power, which is anti-colonial, it means national liberation, the black nation, they come up with some soul power and actually made songs, had songs written about it. Soul power, who was it? Was it Johnny Taylor? Some other forces like that. And that was a part of the direct contest that the liberal sector of the African petty bourgeoisie organization's leadership was making with those who were fighting, who were pushing toward an anti-colonial solution. SNCC became a target of the colonial state, but events were moving too fast to immediately contain the growing anti-colonial radicalization of the African population within current U.S. borders. In Florida, I was jailed for my political activities in St. Petersburg and Gainesville and sentenced to a 5-year prison term at the end of 1966. At the same time, in Oakland, California, the Black Panther Party, influenced by SNCC work in Lowndes County, Alabama, exploded on the scene in dramatic fashion. That wasn't really at the same time. I mean, it was the same time frame. I was jailed in 1966. I think it was maybe December something, 1966, for a demonstration I led to the City Hall as a member of SNCC. We marched from the SNCC office in St. Petersburg, Florida, to downtown St. Petersburg. And this was the first really direct kind of action, Black Power. But Black Power was something that captivated the imagination of people everywhere. In fact, so we marched to the City Hall and went straight into the City Hall building after making some statements on the steps and what have you, and snatched down a mural, an 8 by 10 foot mural that depicted African people in some grotesque caricature and that they wanted to call it art. But we tore it down from the City Hall wall. This had been there for 30 some odd years. Africans and everybody passing by this grotesque monstrosity. And we tore it down and marched down the street. This was Black Power. And everybody knew the Black Power movement was on the scene. You have to really struggle to imagine how this notion of Black Power had affected the consciousness of white people and liberals inside this country and around the world. This was an exciting expression. Black Power, we had real erudite people who won awards for being the best TV analysts and what have you, sitting on, what do they mean by black power? What is black power? Well, you understand black, right? Yes. You understand power, yeah? Yes. Black power is something that was just unfathomable, to the point that we snatched that mural down, and were marching down the streets, and the cop who arrested me, when he put his hands on me, he was literally trembling. The whole idea of black people moving for power was something that shook them up in ways that is very difficult for people to understand. Now, people go today to black power, we want black power, etc., as if that were always the case. And in fact, many people who today talk about black power, and I know because I meet with a lot of them today, and they're not the same individuals, but they're the same types, as Malcolm X might have said, and who love black power. And it's easy to love something after you've thrown your body on the grenade. You know what I mean? You throw your body on the grenade, and that's what SNCC did. We threw our bodies on the grenade, and it made it possible for others to entertain this discussion. So we did this, tore that mural down. That was in December. And barely 4 months later, and this made international news. There were pictures and things like that, Jet Magazine, Centerfold, all of us marching down the street with that mural. And it's hard to imagine now what just snatching a mural down and marching down the streets in black power would mean in 1966. But it was profound. It was earth-shaking. And so that made international news. Then barely 4 months later, after SNCC had done that, in St. Petersburg, Florida, then you had a group of people who went into the state building in Sacramento, California, with guns, in a demonstration with guns. This is what thrust the Black Panther Party into the limelight and historical significance. This was a statement about what was happening at the moment, but also a statement about what we did in December of 1966 that made it possible March of 1967 for the Panthers that were also influenced. We were influencing each other all around the world, and obviously the Panthers were influenced by that act. So the terror of the counterinsurgency unleashed by the U.S. colonial state within U.S. borders was laying waste to much of the anti-colonial resistance. The Black Panther Party was the primary target because of its explosive growth and influence among the most oppressed sectors of the colonized African population. I was constantly in and out of prison because of similar work, primarily in Florida and Kentucky at the time. It was during one of my frequent prison stints that it became clear to me that the era of protest politics was over, that our people had to really fight for power. This was 1966, 67. We're talking about the time of protest politics was over. The time for Black Lives Matter is over. The time for blocking the interstate alone is over. Not to say don't block interstates, don't do any of this thing, but the struggle is the quest for political power, right? So we say that I was also, it was during one of my frequent prison stints that it became clear to me that the era of protest politics was over, that our people had to really fight for power. We had to have a political party, the most effective vehicle for capturing and wielding power. Black power had to be translated as our own black state power. And this was problematic too, because people say, well, what is black power? The guy who was most associated with the slogan Demand Black Power at the time was Stokely Carmichael. And a book was published over his name along with a Professor Hamilton, I think his name might have been Charles Hamilton, I can't remember for sure, called Black Power. This was the thing, but it was basically a liberal articulation that sort of said that, when Jews and Irish moved to a certain kind of community because they were the majority in the community, they, sort of dominated the politic in those communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're saying is that black power had to be translated as our own black state power, By 1972, when our party was formed, the Black Revolution of the 60s was on its last leg as a generalized expression of organized mass struggle. The Black Panther Party, which had borne the brunt of the domestic assault by the U.S. colonial state, had lost most semblance of a revolutionary organization. Many of its leaders had been jailed, exiled, and killed, and others after years of assault and eventual political isolation, were driven to paranoid political immobilization. By this time, the Black Panther Party had little semblance of its former self. The African People's Socialist Party took up the gauntlet. In 1986, 3 years before his death, Huey P. Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party, who once achieved international stature as a prominent revolutionary leader, stated at our Uhuru House in Oakland, California, at one of his last public political speeches, quote, "You might not have the Black Panther Party, but you have the Uhuru House. You might not have the Black Panther newspaper, but you have the burning spear. So they really haven't done anything by crushing one organization," unquote. Indeed, the existence of the Uhuru House in Oakland, California, which at the time was the international headquarters of our party, was part of our work to resuscitate the African Revolution. It was a part of the work to resuscitate the African Revolution. That's what it was about and continues to be about today. Newton was only able to have a venue and an audience for his statement because of our party and the movement we had created in Oakland, where the U.S. was already performing dirges marking the demise of the U.S.-based African liberation movement. The only reason Huey P. Newton had a place that he could come to and make that and other statements in Oakland, California, where the Panthers had been centered, is because the African People's Socialist Party was there. There was no Black Panther Party office that he could have made that, no Black Panther Party venue. The only venue and office that made it possible that continued the revolution even after the Panthers had been killed effectively was the African People's Socialist Party. This is what needs to be understood by all of us. And so our party was organizing resistance to the criminal charges being pressed against Newton by the colonial state at the time. His presence at the Uhuru House was due to our insistence that he fight back. We insisted that Huey fight back. Huey Newton at that time had concluded that he had been so slandered and so effectively neutralized politically, ideologically by the ruling class that people wouldn't come out. People wouldn't support him. We insisted that he come out. We had been doing this over and over again when we would run into him in the streets, or people who were organizers. We assured him that we could bring the people to his defense from ridiculous allegations associated with a school the Panthers once owned that had been destroyed by fire, likely ignited by the U.S. government. The African People's Socialist Party led the campaign to bring Huey P. Newton back into political life in Oakland. When he was assassinated in 1989, it was we who organized the mass resistance against attempts by bourgeois colonial media to slander his name into political revulsion and irrelevance. The African People's Socialist Party did this. It was our party that supported Newton's widow after his assassination, and we who obtained the mortician that presided over his funeral. It was the African People's Socialist Party that organized the honor guard of uniformed members of our party at the public viewing of Newton's body, attended by more than 10,000 people. We printed the program for his funeral. In fact, I was talking to somebody 2 weeks ago in Oakland, California, who remembered how we printed the thing and that we were using hair dryers to dry it off so that it can be ready in time for the funeral. That was Mark Anderson who was talking about that. You know, while the official funeral happened in a major church in Oakland, it was our party that held the mass people's funeral outside the church, conducted by Oakland party leader Comrade Biko Lumumba, from atop a party van surrounded by thousands of working class Africans who could not get in the church. We also led the spontaneous funeral march of thousands that accompanied Newton's hearse at the conclusion of the official ceremony. And while I say a spontaneous march, it was spontaneous in terms of a whole lot of people were there and didn't know what to do. And when the hearse moved, it was our party that led that group of people behind that hearse. And so you have thousands of people following this. This is after what they had tried to do to Newton. The participation of the African People's Socialist Party in the funeral of Huey P. Newton was a continuation of our work in Oakland and was a concrete transition in a historical moment. The African People's Socialist Party was the rising revolutionary force, the current advanced detachment of the African Revolution, providing an honorable, if belated, departure for the leadership of the past. The presence of the African People's Socialist Party in Oakland influenced the consciousness of our people and our movement for liberation. Our decision to reclaim the definition of Newton and the Black Panther Party transformed the colonial narrative and changed the course of history. Changed the course of history. We defeated the efforts of the colonial ruling class media to characterize Newton by the last difficult years of his life, when he had succumbed to the decades of jailings and repression that successfully isolated and demoralized him, reducing him to the stature and habits of too many of our colonized brothers and sisters during the height of the counterinsurgency in the U.S. In other words, Huey had been reduced in so many ways to the stature of all these other Africans out there in the streets trying to survive, trying to live, and what have you. On the morning after the announcement of his death, bourgeois colonial newspapers described Newton as a bum and criminal. His epithet was written by our hated class enemies and national oppressor. On the same morning, our party held rallies at the site of his assassination and showed videos of the heroic days of the Black Panther Party when it had been the revolutionary center of our movement. It was our party that held the march that led hundreds of Africans through the streets of Oakland, deserted of all domestic occupation military forces, chanting, "Who killed Huey? Don't tell no lie, the government, the FBI." They didn't plan for that. The bourgeoisie didn't plan. They expected they would kill Huey P. Newton, describe him the way they wanted him described, and we made a statement. I made a statement to the party. I knew that Huey was dead before most people, because Bakri Olatunji was a nurse working at Highland Hospital when they brought Huey P. Newton in, and he called me early in the morning and said, they just brought Huey in, he's been shot in the head, he's dead. And then we made a statement that before Huey P. Newton's funeral, we, the African People's Socialist Party, will have defined who Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party was. We said that we were going to, and we did it. And we took it on. A massive struggle. Scorched earth. You couldn't go any place in Oakland, California where you did not find images of the silhouette of Huey P. Newton with this iconic picture of him standing with a shotgun everywhere, all over Oakland, sidewalks, on every place where it was possible to put that image up. We did that. And then we had demonstrations, and the police, after killing Huey, you couldn't find a cop on the streets in the African community of Oakland, California. They disappeared from the streets, and we took the streets, and we did this. And this is what I mean when we say we changed the course of history, because they were going to use the murder of Huey P. Newton as an attack on the liberation movement itself and define what the liberation movement was all about, and we didn't allow them to do that. That's who we are. Left to their own devices, the hated imperialist rulers would have created the myth that they detested Newton because he was a bum and a criminal, and not because he led an incredible liberation movement that raised many working-class African people from the depths of the social, spiritual, and political morass created for us by U.S. colonial capitalism. So, yeah, they're going to say they hated Newton because he was a bum and a criminal. But we know they work with bums and criminals all the time. Sometimes they call them black elected officials, or reverend this and that, you know. But they didn't hate Newton because of that. They didn't find it necessary to kill Newton even after he was dead because of that. They hated Newton because he had raised up so many African working class and other peoples around the world. Newton traveled and met with Fidel, and he met with revolutionary people in China and represented black liberation movement, Vietnam, and what have you. He was a living expression of the height of revolutionary resistance. And I'm saying this, we had serious political and ideological differences with the Black Panther Party. But there was no way you could liquidate the fact that the Black Panther Party represented the revolutionary center inside this country and much of the world. And even much of what we did as first Jomo coming after SNCC was influenced by what the Black Panther Party had done before us. As the Black Panther Party, by the way, was influenced by SNCC before it. Although the attempt continues to be made to define Newton outside of his role as a leader of our struggle against colonial capitalist domination, our party rescued the definition of our anti-colonial struggle from the poisoned sewer of white nationalist contempt that rose up with Newton's assassination. It is only because the African working class and our colonized nation had an advanced detachment, a revolutionary party that functions as the general staff of our struggle for national liberation, unification, and socialism, that the colonial rulers were unable to rewrite our history of revolutionary resistance. I'm trying to see. I surely talked a lot before getting into this study. Okay. It is a law of dialectics that the old must give way for the new. This applies to the dynamics within our anti-colonial movement as well as the dynamic between our liberation struggle and the parasitic capitalist system. This is why we are not intimidated by what appears to be the strength of our colonial capitalist oppressor at the moment. All evidence exposes the reality that U.S. bluster today is the anxious braggadocio of a symptomatic impotence, the bluster of an imperialism in decline on its deathbed. We ain't scared. We never tailed the masses as did so many others. We exposed the bourgeois selections of Nelson Mandela and Barack Hussein Obama as the imposition of neo-colonialism, even when the masses wanted them to represent a victory for the African people. The African People's Socialist Party always led, even through periods when our positions were temporarily unpopular, until the truth of the party's analysis revealed itself to the masses. We have always fought to defend the anti-colonial revolution of the African nation. We have always functioned as the advanced detachment of our nation and class, dragging our struggle to new heights from the depths of defeat. There were others who organized different events around any number of issues during this period. Some were repudiating past commitments to revolution, and for some, coalition building became the buzzword as the way forward. The African People's Socialist Party, our organization, was determined to solve the problems of the revolution. Our people and our movement needed a revolutionary party of steel cadre, guided by revolutionary principles and advanced revolutionary theory. We had to fiercely fight to build the party of the African working class, the only social force capable of leading the struggle of African national liberation, unification, and socialism to a successful conclusion. The African working class, under the leadership of his own revolutionary party, conscious of his own selfish interests and guided by the revolutionary theory of African internationalism, had to lead our struggle for victory over colonial capitalism and usher in a new world free of class exploitation and human oppression. Comrades, the Advanced Detachment understands that revolution is not an event. It is a process. Revolution is a science and an art that requires for its leadership advanced revolutionary theory and a disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries. My political report to the Sixth Congress, An Uneasy Equilibrium, spoke to the party's work to maintain the life and direction of the Black Revolution of the 60s, and I quote, "Since the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, the masses of the people have been sidelined, pushed out of political life. What passes for struggle is relegated most often to single-issue activism that is nothing but an appendage to social media militancy or liberal and other bourgeois schemes." And I want to say single-issue activism and these small circles. You know, people get their own little tiny organization over here, little small circles that really deflects from the need to build the revolutionary party of the African working class. I mean, the African People's Socialist Party has been here for almost 50 years, and we've the part of what we're talking about, solving the problems of the revolution here, is a reflection of that, not just being here, not just some static force. And what we find is that many people who talk about revolution today, they're simply using definitions and words and terms that's used from the 1960s that do not reflect any kind of development. They're just terms and words that people bandy about. Then this single issue militancy, and we support many of the single issues that people are talking about. These small circles are poor substitutes for revolutionary party that is informed by revolutionary theory and the mission for the total liberation and unification of Africa and African people worldwide. There ain't going to be no other kind of freedom. So how can you be satisfied with some other kind of response? Like, it's not viable. The significance of our party lies in the fact that we have never surrendered or deviated from the path of the same African revolution that motivated the imperialist white power attacks in the 20th century. We continue to lead despite the general setbacks suffered by our movement as a whole. We are the only organization that correctly analyzed the fact that the black revolution of the 60s was defeated by imperialist counterinsurgency. A military attack intended to keep our people and our movement from ever rising up again. You have to be able to recognize that. That's what I'm saying. This is a good friend that I was struggling with just the other day. It's not the first time I've had this struggle, because this is romantic idealism, that revolution is invincible, that you can crush a revolution, defeat revolution, and they have been defeated, and ours will defeat. Because if you don't say that happened, then what people can see is a certain kind of historical continuum, that Obama is part of the success, and other stuff that we see happening today is part of the success of the movement. No, we say they are part of the defeat of the movement. You have to be able to say that, because if you don't, then what we do is live in a continuous situation of anything. You don't have to do anything. We say revolutions are led. And not only are they led, but there are certain kinds of organization that's necessary to lead them. There are certain kinds of principles necessary to make revolution. Otherwise, you don't have to do anything. Say, no, it wasn't defeated. No, revolution lives forever, etc. So why do you have to do anything? Why build a revolutionary organization? Why build revolutionary parties, etc.? Comrades, sisters and brothers and sisters, delegates to the 7th Congress, when our party came to Oakland, it was not in anticipation that we would be there to fight for a dignified departure of Comrade Huey P. Newton. We did not go to Oakland to preside over the passage of an end of black revolutionary struggle. Our presence in Oakland was a natural consequence of the party's growth and our determination to complete the black revolution of the 60s. Our political trek began with the founding of the African People's Socialist Party, an act which in and of itself raised our struggle to a higher level, even as the U.S. government was confident of its success in destroying it. In 1972, in Florida, where the black rights fighters of Fort Myers and the Gainesville Black Study Group joined with the Hunter militant organization JOMO to build the African People's Socialist Party, we were working to build the inaugural African Liberation Day mobilization scheduled for May 27 in Washington, D.C. Our participation in the subsequent African Liberation Day mobilization from that point on has been to continue the revolutionary trajectory of our movement that was being effectively crushed by U.S. imperialism within its borders. The task of solving the problems of the revolution meant that we had to resolve the host of organizational, political, and theoretical contradictions blocking the progress of revolutionary development. Our organizational response was the creation of the African People's Socialist Party, an organization of professional revolutionaries as a necessary vehicle for advancing the interests of our nation under the revolutionary leadership of the African working class. With the development of the party, we open up new fronts of struggle throughout the African world. Theoretically, our party opened up a major offensive against outdated, failed philosophical worldviews and vigorously advanced struggles against the hostile ideology of the colonial oppressor, state, and its devotees within the colonial community, our colonized community. We made determined struggles against philosophical idealism. This included incessant ideological war against the definition of our struggle as being against racism, which can only be an effort to perfect the system of oppression by changing the minds or feelings of the white colonial oppressors. Black Lives Matter. This has included an ideological offensive against religious obscurantism and various expressions of mysticism, and the notion that our liberation will result from speeches by some individual genius or the discovery of secret documents that, once received, would automatically confer freedom upon our people. The theory of African internationalism necessary for the success of our revolution was developed to provide an ongoing guide for our struggle in the wake of the demonstrated inadequacies of organized, practiced, idealist, and metaphysically influenced Marxism that did not recognize the centrality of parasitism and the colonial question. Again, the theory of African internationalism necessary for the success of our revolution was developed to provide an ongoing guide for our struggle in the wake of the demonstrated inadequacies of organized, practiced, idealist, and metaphysically influenced Marxism that did not recognize the centrality of parasitism and the colonial question. As the Advanced Detachment, only we have been able to spread our theory and grow our political influence through the publication of our 50-year-old political journal, the Burning Spear newspaper, read by thousands of Africans and colonists throughout the world, and within the brutal colonial prison concentration camps. Our internet radio stations, the Uhuru Radio and the 2 FM radio stations, Black Power 96.3 and 100.1, owned by a constituent organization of our movement, enhanced this work of anti-colonial socialist party propaganda. Another problem that had gone unaddressed since the U.S. government's effective destruction of the Garvey movement in the early part of the last century was the question of African unification and liberation. Africans can be united globally once again under a single leadership with a single center. Like Garvey, we know that a liberated and united Africa can only occur under a single revolutionary organizational leadership. We passed a resolution calling for the establishment of the African Socialist International at our first Congress in 1981. But our work to build the unity of the International African Liberation Movement preceded this Congress by many years. We organized the first U.S.-based support committee for the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, that at the time in the early 1970s was engaged in armed struggle against the white settler regime of Rhodesia. We also led much of the work of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, PAC, during its early stages in the U.S., placing staff in its New York United Nations office and sponsoring and escorting PAC leaders to events in the U.S., many of which were organized by our party. We spoke at the United Nations and participated in general demonstrations there in support of the Pan-Africanist Congress. We reprinted many of their publications for their use in propaganda work. Our efforts to win ZANU and PAC leadership to formal participation in the African Socialist International were unsuccessful. Our party pursued the efforts up to the point where negotiated settlements resulted in transfer of direct political power from the white settler colonialists to African neo-colonial custody in the form of ZANU in Zimbabwe and to the African National Congress in occupied Azania, called South Africa. The transfer of direct political power to the African petty bourgeoisie revealed the ideological weaknesses of ZANU and PAC, leading them to abandon their efforts for revolutionary siege of real African worker-peasant power, instead functioning within the neo-colonial state structures previously utilized by the white settler colonialists of Rhodesia and South Africa. From its inception, our party united the struggle for political independence with concrete work to build African economic self-reliance through programs of dual and contending African working class power. We have always known that the political and economic are one. Who created the decades-old economic institutions to teach African anti-colonial self-reliance? It was we who organized Ujamaa Restaurant in Florida in 1972, an Africans Connection bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky in 1979. We opened the first African-owned commercial newspaper and later a bookstore and record shop in Gainesville, Florida, even as we built Spear Graphics and then Uhuru Bakery Cafe in Oakland in the 1980s. Throughout the years, we have never been without our own independent economic infrastructure, committed to ensuring that our party would never be economically beholden to anyone or anything that would demand political adherence to another worldview. Uhuru Foods and Pies was born in Oakland in 1980 and is still growing today. The dynamic Uhuru furniture stores in Philadelphia and Oakland continue to thrive after nearly 30 years of operation. The party established a nonprofit entity, the African People's Education and Defense Fund, to host, as APEDF, to host community programs in defense of the human and civil rights of the African community. APEDF today encompasses Uhuru Furniture and Collectibles, the African Independence Workforce Program, and other economic programs of the party created over the past 3 or more decades. We have built dynamic Uhuru houses with their Aquaba halls in St. Petersburg, Florida, Oakland, California, and now in St. Louis, Missouri. We created Black Star Industries that include Uhuru Foods and Pies, Planet Uhuru Apparel, One Africa, One Nation marketplaces, Burning Spear Publications, and other institutions that comprise the foundation of a liberated African working class economy, an expression of dual and contending power. In the early 2000s, the party formed the All-African People's Development and Empowerment Project, APDEP, to bring African skilled scientists, engineers, and doctors into organization under the leadership of the African working class. APDEP opened Zenzele Consignment in Huntsville, Alabama, a consignment shop that functions as an ongoing resource generation institution for the organization. Zenzele will function as the headquarters of APDEP, where the community can shop and volunteer, and where the organization's national and international projects can be showcased. For the past 8 years, Deputy Chair Onozene Ishitela has headed up the party's economic front, catapulting our existing institutions into a new level of success with a growing list of economic entities. Our 7th Congress, taking place in part at our latest Uhuru House in Louisville, Missouri, is simply a continuation of our history of leading by example as the Advanced Detachment. I say in part because the Uhuru House in St. Louis was too small for at least one aspect of it, and we were in St. Louis, and part of it was held in the Uhuru House, and other aspects were in larger venues. We are practical revolutionaries. This is why we initiated the Black Power Blueprint, a major project that is helping to transform the entire African colony of St. Louis. We have renovated the 9,000 square foot building that was a community eyesore just a few months ago on a major thoroughfare. It was a property like so many in St. Louis waiting to be added to the list of gentrified booty for the array of realtors and investors that perennially lurk in the shadows, working with financial institutions, government officials, and neo-colonial sycophants to undermine our community to a status of inhabitability as a prelude for moving us out. Instead, with the determined direct leadership of the Office of Deputy Chair Onozene Ishitela, we are advancing dynamic economic initiatives. When we say that politics is concentrated economics, and that the political and economics are one, we mean exactly what is being demonstrated in St. Louis. The pending St. Louis Uhuru Bakery and Cafe is part of the Black Power Blueprint plan, along with the intended workforce development program to train Africans who have been given felony convictions by the colonial state and prison system that are used to lock Africans out of employment possibilities. The amazing array of economic institutions developed and or led by Deputy Chair Onozene Ishitela are consistent with the party's drive to pursue, by example, our ongoing 600-year-old struggle against foreign and alien colonial domination of African people. Another problem solved by our party was to give reality to the demand for reparations that had been talked about within the National Liberation Movement for generations. It was we who took the reparations demand out of the straitjacket of purely legal and legislative approaches. We are the organization that gave the reparations demand a mass and concrete character. We deepened the theoretical and political basis for the demand and began the practical process of acquiring reparations that made it a reality and not just wishful thinking. I want to say something about that because we don't talk about it too much on purpose. But it's really important that people say, well, who's going to get the reparation? What's it going to look like? We're getting it. When we talk about Black Power Blueprint, we're talking in part about a consequence of reparation. We built organizations that connected directly to the struggle for reparations, and not just when we say that moving the reparations demand from the legislative and legal approaches, we're saying that we're winning people. We're winning Africans to the reparations demand, and when Africans really grasp this demand, we don't have to worry about legislation or any kind of legal stuff. We will take it. And then we're winning North Americans, European from the colonizer, who not only give reparations, but organize other colonial colonizers to unite with the demand for reparations. There's a whole movement that's happening right under the noses of people who are claiming to be for reparations that's getting reparations right now. The African People's Socialist Party initiated that. And this movement exists in at least 130 some odd cities in the United States, and at least 30 states in the United States, where active, ongoing work by individuals and organizations demanding and winning white people to the reparations demand. This is going on right now. This is the African People's Socialist Party. When our party began this work, the so-called reparations movement was only considering compensation for African colonial slavery. It was we who recognized that the rate of exploitation of Africa and African people has grown greater since the formal end of our legal enslavement. And if today you find, and you will find, that the reparations so-called movement talks about reparations beyond slavery, it's because of our influence of the African People's Socialist Party. Because up until then, the only thing they talked about for reparations was for slavery. We pursued and demanded and pushed the fact that reparations due not just for people who, just because of slavery, because you know what the white colonial masters say any damn way, is that, well, nobody's alive who from slavery. Well, we're alive today. And we're not just talking about something that happened in the 19th century. We're talking about something that happened yesterday, 30 minutes ago, something that's happening even as we have this discussion that requires reparations. Beyond that, the entire rotten capitalist social system, everything that is in the possession of white people and the whole social system, everything, every dream, every aspiration requires the ongoing theft of resources and the oppression of African people for their success. We want reparations for the whole damn thing. That's the reparations demand that we're talking about. So we say the existing reparations movement of today bears the imprint of the work of the Advanced Detachment of the African working class and forcibly dispersed African nation. It bears the imprint of the African People's Socialist Party. It was we who made the reparations demand a mass demand of our people. It never was before, I'm telling you. In 1982, we formed the African National Reparations Organization, ANRO. ANRO held reparations tribunal throughout the United States for 12 years in different states throughout the United States. In fact, most of the noted reparations activists of today gained their reparations involvement through a direct or indirect relationship to the work of our party, and we could name them. Only the Advanced Detachment would be able to use the political device of international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rights of oppressed peoples to bring their cases before the bourgeois world court. Only African internationalists could inform us of the necessary conclusion that reparations are owed because of parasitic capitalism and our stolen labor, land, and resources. Our understanding that the reparations demand is a function of the revolution allowed the party to open a serious front among the colonizer population. Through the reparations demand, we are able to win thousands of whites to conscious participation in the assault on white nationalist colonialism through the reparations demand. For some, their introduction to active political life was and is in the reparations work created and led by our party. It is our party that took the mystery out of the question of white people. We brought the definition of white people down to earth, destroying the myths and biological and religious determinism. The myths of biological and religious determinism. What we mean by that is that there are some who are not historical materialists, who are not African internationalists, who assume that white people do what white people do because of some predetermined genetically informed process, that somehow that's just the white people are because of genetics or because of some religious thing, of they're the great Satan, the devil, and all of this other kind of stuff. That's not helpful at all. Unless you want to build an army of religious geneticists, that's not helpful at all. We advanced the often unpopular declaration that white people are people whose behavior can be explained by a scientific, historical, materialist analysis. We resolved the outstanding question of white people in a practical way with the formation of the African People's Solidarity Committee, APSC, in 1976. The organization of whites working under our leadership with the strategic assignment of collecting reparations from North Americans to forward our struggle for African national liberation. And there's been some confusion around this question because some people see the white people in the movement and they say, well, all them white people are really ones. And then some people say, well, the white people get all the money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's nonsense. And some people say, well, if the white people are giving money, that means they run. No. What it is, it's just like when you go to the bank and there's a black teller at the bank, it doesn't mean the black teller owns the bank. It doesn't mean that just because there's a black teller there, they're going to give you some money under the counter that white people might not get. Everything, every institution that has been created, unlike the normal relationship where black people, African people work and create value that's owned by white people, every institution from furniture stores to you name it, owned by our party. It's ours, it's owned by our party. And there has been a time in the history where we destroyed an economic institution that had been pulled together and quit and fired and dismantled the solidarity movement. It's ours. That's what really needs to be understood by everybody. When you hear this other kind of stuff, it's nonsense. Somebody said, well, I went on the internet and I saw on the internet. So if you saw it on the internet, you know damn well it was meant to be a secret, right? Whatever you saw on the internet's there because we put it on the internet, stupid. You know, it's not that it didn't get there magically, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's the African People's Socialist Party created mass organizations that made it necessary for us to abandon, that made it unnecessary. And this is really important. The African People's Socialist Party created mass organizations that made it unnecessary for us to abandon our revolutionary trajectory in order to win non-revolutionary masses to the revolutionary politics, programs, and leadership of the party. No. You don't say, okay, I know we have to make a revolution, but the people aren't ready for it. Therefore, moving from the revolution, we'll go back and just have a civil rights movement. No. You say, as revolutionaries, what we will do, revolutionary party, create cadre who can build a civil rights organization that will bring people to the revolution as part of the revolution. You don't say we're going to become reformists because the people have not yet come to revolutionary conclusions. We say, having come to revolutionary conclusion, build revolutionary organization, created revolutionary cadre, we can take people and engage them and struggle for reform that takes them to the revolution, and that's on the agenda all the time. Otherwise, it's just opportunism that calls itself revolution. Politically, we initiate, and that's why all these people, many of these people who are running around with their little single issue stuff, their little small circle stuff, because the people are not yet ready for the revolution, need to join the damn revolution and help the people get ready for the revolution through the avenues and venues that we've created in the party. And I just want to say that we have created all kinds of mass organizations, mass struggles, political struggles around political prisoners. I mean, so we're not like we just say, like there's one organization who used to say that their only thing on their agenda, the only strategy they had was to build the party. We just build the party. We don't engage in any struggle or any contest with imperialism. We just build the party. That's ridiculous. And what it meant is they have an organization of careerists that don't engage in the struggle against imperialism. They just have studies on it. They study on a regular basis. They like we got all these universities with really educated African people that don't make revolution. We say that that's not good enough. So we've created we've created a revolutionary mass organization. We've engaged in struggle to free political prisoners, sometimes in our own name, sometimes in the names of committees that we've created, like the National Committee to Defend Desi Woods or the Free Desi Woods. We participated in the struggle to free Pitts and Lee. We organized that. We freed Pitts and Lee, even though the bourgeoisie never accepted that. We disrupted campaigns not only for the governor of the state of Florida, but this guy was somebody who was being prepared to be Jimmy Carter. He was prepared to be the Southern representative of imperialist white power. His name was Reuben Askew. He was the governor of Florida. We disrupted it, made it impossible for him to do that because of what we did in wrecking that campaign to free Pitts and Lee. One, and also because in Pensacola, Florida, where he was from, the highway patrol that killed this young brother, whose last name was Blackwell, blew his head off, 21 years old, and our party intervened in that because I had a physical confrontation struggle with the sheriff of what's the name, Escambia County, I think that's where Tallahassee is, in the governor's office. Right there in the governor's office, me and the sheriff are wrestling, in a wrestling match and what have you. We did that. We participated in all these struggles. So it's not like we just waiting for a revolution to descend upon us. We're making revolution from 1,000 different fronts because the party has to lead everything. And that's who we are. So I'm going to finally just say something about that we have a legacy of international solidarity. We've demonstrated practical unity with the people who occupied Palestine. We've gone to meetings of the Palestinian Revolution, and our position is much more severe than the position that emerged as the former position of the Palestinian Revolution, where they're talking about they will accept something like 20% of Palestine in a deal with the Jewish state, which was ridiculous from the first place. And this was a position of having been pushed back. And the Palestinians, perhaps certainly as much as anybody else on the planet Earth, been pushed into a state of almost irrelevancy in public view. The oppression and exploitation and attacks on Palestine and the Palestinian people, and somehow the Palestinian people carried the burden for what the other white people did in Europe and Germany to kill Jewish people. Now the Palestinian people are the ones who have to pay the price for it, and they've won this battle, at least apparently, for the whole world to be able to denounce Palestine and Palestinians for trying to fight and take back their resources, and especially if they don't fight the way that has been recognized as the appropriate way to fight, right? So we were there. We are on the front lines in the struggle for the liberation of Nicaragua. We were on the front lines. We represented that movement in a more serious way right here in the United States. We organized the first events and mobilization and solidarity with the Sandinista movement. We were there with the Iranians, and we fought with the Iranians when the Iranians couldn't make public appearances without having paper bags over their heads in demonstrations because of the notoriously efficient and vicious SAVAK, the secret intelligence organization of the Shah of Iran that was put there with the United States, by the United States government to oppress the people. It was we who were in the front lines of that struggle. It was we who fought in 1979 battles in Gainesville, Florida, in the streets of Gainesville, Florida, against white people who were yelling, "Sand niggas, go home," talking about the people of Iran, and send the Klan to Iran. That was the African People's Socialist Party, when nobody else was doing it. And sectors of the African liberation movement denounced us for doing that because the Iranians are white people too. That kind of nonsense. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff we could say, but the comrade director of agitation and propaganda has ordered me to cease and desist so that we can at least pretend that we're going to have some further discussion. Uhuru, comrade.
Let's salute our leadership. Thank you, Chairman, for that powerful study. It is now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's tuning in via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate all of your engagement. Please continue to invite your friends and family to this study and share widely on all of your social media platforms. Want to recognize where people are viewing from: Clearwater, St. Petersburg, Tampa, Florida, Fort Myers, Florida, Roselle, New Jersey, Jamaica, Rotterdam, Netherlands, Chicago, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, Tucson, Arizona, Kansas City, Missouri. We have Stanger, I can't pronounce this. It's in occupied Azania, or they call it South Africa. Huntsville, Alabama, Richmond, Virginia, Hempstead, New York, New York, New York, Oakland, California, and San Diego, California. Benjamin Prado from Unión del Barrio says, Uhuru Comrades, Unión del Barrio is in unity with you. Stephen Biko Gaidi is viewing on Facebook in South Africa, comments, great lecture, comrade. David Martinez on Facebook comments, Amalia Chitella delivered a powerful speech in Jamaica. Comrade Adamu Eterno in Rotterdam, Netherlands says a sharp sense of righteousness, equity, equity, justice, equality, honor, and decency is certainly one of the defining aspects of the African worldview. Nasir Al-Amin in Kuwait, in regards to your statement about you having a long-winded overview, said, no, the long-winded overview is insightful. It's an appreciated addition to the text. Maisha Bright in Baltimore, Maryland is viewing on YouTube, says, I love you, Chairman. Angela La Cruz on YouTube comments, Amalia Chitella inspires me. Comrade Raya Fogarty, a member of APSC in St. Louis, says, Uhuru, Chairman Amalia Chitella. And the Comrade Adamu asks, Uhuru Chairman, are there crucial mistakes made by our comrades, the black revolutionaries of the 60s themselves, leading to / in the context of the defeat of the whole movement? If so, if such mistakes have been identified, are there ways to avoid them this time around?
Uhuru. I will appreciate that, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, the party's plenary, which is something that we try to do annually between Congress of the party. And this plenary happening from February 1st through the 3rd, we actually need another day upon reflection, is titled Vanguard Up, the unity of theory and practice. And that was a fundamental contradiction we were confronted with. In the 1960s, we just hadn't developed. We had so little political experience, so little political maturity. We didn't have the advantage of revolutionary veterans. No matter, some people can point to one or two people who were really important at the time, but we really didn't have the advantage of revolutionary veterans. And this time around, what is different, what is distinctly different, is that unlike the 1960s, where we saw people come to revolutionary conclusions and develop what they call revolutionary organizations, a part of a kind of spontaneity, where people were pushed to that. We started off as liberal and reformist movements, whether that was in Congo with people like Lumumba, or in Ghana with people like Nkrumah, or whether that was inside the United States. We started off as sort of a reformists and liberals, and sometimes militant reformists, and then we came to certain kinds of revolutionary conclusions in that process. This time, unlike then, we have the advantage of beginning. We're starting this process with the Revolutionary Party, where the objective right now is the seizure and wielding of political power. We don't have to learn. We have the advantage of that history now. In the 60s, we did not have the advantages of that history. And the other thing is that most of the revolutionary organizations of the past only had a lifespan of something like 3 years or more. Not too many more years than that. The African People's Socialist Party has been here for more than 40 years, almost 50 years as a revolutionary organization, and that is a fundamental difference. So it's not to say we won't make mistakes. There are going to be traitors, as you have seen. There have been traitors in our party. People who slander, do everything they can to undermine the revolution, etc. I was quoting somebody some time ago who talked about like Du Bois and others who attacked Garvey, and the UNI, Garvey must go, even as they characterized themselves as progressives and people who were trying to fight for a better future. Their assault was on Garvey and not on the social system. And people have done that in our party, from our party. They've deserted the revolution, and they've done those kinds of things. We've had people, they're going to be agents. There have been agents in our party. There are probably agents in the party now. There's no way that you can avoid that. Only thing we can do is hold high our principles, especially the main organization principle of democratic centralism, holding the whole organization accountable, and making sure that everything is wedded to the philosophy of African internationalism, and fight to have genuine cadre that's not liberal and that's connected to these concrete principles that we're fighting for. That's the only thing we can do. That's a lot, though. Uhuru. I mean, even the Russian Revolution. I like to quote this because the Bolshevik Revolution, and I quote this because this is an example of a successful seizure of state power. And the Bolshevik Revolution under V.I. Lenin created the kind of organization in terms of the type of organization that the African People's Socialist Party is. But right on the eve of the seizure of state power, there were two members of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Revolution who told the state that these guys are going to seize power, who actually put it in the newspaper that they plan to take power on such and such a day. And they did it. And by the way, one of them ended up being the person who Lenin put in charge of the Communist International, even after the Bolshevik Revolution, after it was known that this guy did this. I mean, this was, so we're going to have this kind of situation where traitors, snitches, just horrible people, and you can't always tell, because the thing is, the revolution is optimistic, and revolutionaries are optimistic. We have, we have, real high expectations of people, and we believe in the people to do the right thing. But we are also governed by revolutionary organizational principles that should frustrate the ability of most of the traitors to do what they do. And what we found that in most instances where people were able to get away with committing crimes against the people and crimes against the party, that the evidence of who they were was before us all the time. And for whatever reason, liberalism and something else, we made excuses for them that allowed them to be there. We shan't do that as easily anymore. Uhuru.
Uhuru. So we have one more time. We have time for one more question, and this one is: Uhuru Chairman, did assassinations and incarceration of cadre in the '60s revolution directly lead to the dominance of the black petty bourgeoisie today? That comes from Morty in Richmond, Virginia.
That's one of the things, but what you really need to understand is there was a whole comprehensive program, whole comprehensive assault on our movement. Most people know about what we call COINTELPRO. That was the thing that was led by the domestic secret political police in this country, the FBI. And there's evidence that's there. You can find it, the list of objectives to destroy the rebel. But most people don't know that the FBI was not the only entity. There were military secret police organizations. There was the CIA. And you should look this up. They had a program called Chaos. And we're talking about enemy state, organization of assassins. This is a literal truth. Who perfected methods of poisoning and torturing, mind control efforts, that LSD and other things that they used to attack the revolutionary movement, whole things that we've seen and considered social phenomena in this country were efforts that were done by these kind of intelligence organizations. The sudden advent in the middle of the black revolution of the 60s of the so-called drug-addled hippie movement, to make love and not war, a certain kind of radical peace stuff. So as opposed to effing up the state, just F everybody else that you could. I mean, it was just, and LSD, the drugs, LSD, the marijuana, the other kinds of drugs that was put all over. This was not accidental either. There were all kinds of struggles made against. Movies, the CIA actually brought the rights to certain movies, to books, movies. The Animal Farm being one example that was written by Orwell, I think it was, that was to be some kind of anti-communist thing that they put out. They did that with other kinds of, even Motown, I'm told, was affected by that. And certain music came out that in the middle of a revolution, you were dancing in the streets. I mean, it's just all kinds of things used against us. So yeah, assassination was an aspect of it, but was more than assassination. And one other aspect that I cannot overstate and I cannot miss is the role of the so-called white left, and especially the so-called new communist movement that consolidated itself in this new version of Marxism and Maoism and all this other stuff, not based primarily on an attack, on an ideological, philosophical attack on imperialism, but an ideological and philosophical attack on the black liberation movement. And so that's a part of the whole. The counterinsurgency was much more complex than just killing a leader or two. You can't kill a revolution just by killing a leader or two. You have to do more than that, and they did it. And the connection with bourgeois media. And there were people, for example, when Malcolm X went throughout Africa, they sent a person who was the head of the Congress of Racial Equality. He, in fact, got my lawyer. He got me a lawyer. I can't think of his name now. He has a very sonorous, deep voice, and he was a great speaker. What was his name? He headed the Congress of Racial Equality. You know, and then he went to travel behind Malcolm X all over Africa to undermine everything Malcolm had said. They used people like Carl, what was his name? The guy who, anyway, from aid, you know, was it aid? No, American, what was that media outlet that the U.S. government created? Anyway, it has a whole media thing, some kind of a Voice of America stuff. I mean, they use all kinds of instruments against us, and it's really comprehensive. So it wasn't just, you know, it was a women's movement that came out, not just attacking us, but right after the Iranian Revolution. One of the big leaders of the women's liberation movement ran first into Iran to liberate the women of Iran from the veil. Now, all the time the Shah was there destroying everything, they had no intent or interest in going there, but as soon as the revolution happens, this is the kind of stuff that they unleash, and I've talked too long. Uhuru.
Well, because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. And this study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. Time is running out. Sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise taking place December 14th through the 19th. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is the annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overturning the conditions faced by African people worldwide. Our cruise destinations are Half Moon Cay, Bahamas, Nassau, Bahamas, and Freeport, Bahamas. You can enjoy political education on board with the chairman, on and off board excursions, and more food than you can eat. To book your trip, visit uhurulegacycruise.org or call the travel agent Linda Stern at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the ASI and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. Start preparing now for the African People's Socialist Party's 2020 plenary following our 7th Congress, happening February 1st through the 3rd in St. Petersburg, Florida, themed Vanguard Up, Unity of Theory and Practice. You can register and read the call to the plenary today at apspplenary.org. On March 27th through the 29th, 2020, the African National Women's Organization will be holding the Black Women's Convention, Sisters United for Revolution, in Philadelphia. Registration is open for this dynamic event at ANWO, that's ANWO, BWC.eventbrite.com. Come see the leadership of revolutionary African women doing this work for our freedom, being on the front lines for revolution. Featured at this event will be presentations from African women in our party and movement, workshops, culture, and so much more. For more information about the convention, visit convention.anwouhuru.org. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is hosting its 4th annual electoral campaign school in St. Louis, Missouri at Aquaba Hall, 4101 West Florissant on April 10th to the 12th, 2020, themed The Ballot and the Bullet. The school is a means by which the coalition opens up a new front of struggle for Black self-determination within the U.S. and elsewhere. The school will teach ordinary Africans, workers, activists, women, and youth how to run for office. The weekend of events will include presentations from members of the BIB Steering Committee and other special guests. Stay tuned to blackisbackcoalition.org for more details, including registration and our list of featured speakers. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of Amali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.
Uhuru.